Right now, you might be sitting completely alone, or you might be in a crowded room, at work, at a party, surrounded by people, and still feel completely alone. Here's the thing your brain doesn't tell you, it doesn't actually care which one is true. As far as your body is concerned, loneliness isn't a mood. It's not just in your head the way people sometimes dismiss it. Your body treats chronic loneliness the way it treats a physical wound, activating stress systems, raising inflammation, even changing how your immune system behaves at a genetic level. According to one of the largest analyses ever conducted on the subject, the health impact of sustained loneliness is roughly equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Not stress, not bad sleep. For most of human history, this reaction made perfect sense. Today, for a growing number of people, it's quietly running in the background of an otherwise ordinary life. Let's start with that cigarette comparison, because it's not a casual exaggeration. It comes from real data. In 2010, researcher Julian Holt-Lundstad and her colleagues published a meta-analysis combining data from 148 separate studies covering more than 300,000 people. They looked at how strong someone's social relationships were and then tracked how long those people lived. The result? People with weak social connections had a significantly higher risk of dying early, a risk increase comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day and larger than the risks associated with obesity or physical inactivity. But here's the important distinction the study made clear. This isn't about how many people are physically around you, it's about loneliness, the subjective feeling of disconnection versus social isolation, the objective lack of contact. You can have one without the other. And it's the feeling, not the head count that your body responds to. So, what does your body actually do with that feeling? In 2003, neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger and her team at UCLA ran an experiment using a simple computer ball tossing game called Cyberball. Participants thought they were playing online with two other people, but those players were actually controlled by the researchers. And at a certain point, they simply stopped passing the ball. The participant was left out. While this was happening, participants were inside an fMRI scanner, and the brain activity researchers recorded during that moment of social exclusion lit up the same regions, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, that activate when someone experiences physical pain. Not similar regions, but the same ones. Being excluded even from a meaningless game with strangers registered in the brain as something closer to an injury than an emotion, and it doesn't stop at the moment of exclusion. Psychologist John Cacioppo, who spent roughly 3 decades at the University of Chicago studying loneliness until his death in 2018, found that chronic loneliness puts the brain into a kind of low grade alert mode, something researchers call implicit hypervigilance for social threat. In practice, this means a lonely brain starts scanning its environment differently. Neutral faces get interpreted as slightly more hostile. Ambiguous social situations get read as slightly more rejecting. The brain, expecting to be hurt again, starts looking for evidence that it will be, which often makes people withdraw further, even when connection is available. Cacioppo's research also found that lonely people experience more fragmented sleep, more brief awakenings throughout the night, even ones they don't remember. It is likely because an ancient part of the brain considers being alone even while asleep, a state that calls for staying slightly alert. This shows up at the genetic level too. Stephen Cole, working with Cacioppo, studied something called social genomics, how social experience changes which genes get expressed inside your immune cells. Their research found that chronically lonely people show a distinct pattern. Genes involved in inflammation get turned up, while genes involved in fighting viruses get turned down. In other words, a lonely body starts preparing for the wrong kind of threat. It gears up as if it's expecting a physical wound, something to fight off with inflammation rather than the viral infections that tend to come from being around other people. It's a strange kind of mismatch. Evolution built a body that's very good at healing cuts and fighting off infections that travel through crowds. What it didn't build, because the situation almost never came up, was a body that knows how to handle being alone for months or years at a time. And that's really the core of it. For nearly all of human history, being isolated from your group wasn't an emotional inconvenience.
It was a death sentence. Humans evolved in small, interdependent bands, and a person separated from that band had no one to share food with, no one to warn them about predators, no one to help if they got hurt. In that environment, the discomfort of loneliness wasn't a malfunction, it was a survival signal, as urgent biologically as hunger or thirst pushing a person to do whatever it took to get back to the group. Cacioppo described loneliness as exactly that, an alarm, not a flaw. The problem is that this alarm system evolved for small bands of 15 to 50 people who saw each other every single day. It was never designed for a world where someone can have 800 online friends and not have a single person to call at 2 a.m. That gap is exactly what's driving what public health officials now describe as a crisis. In 2023, US Surgeon General Vivek Murthy released a formal advisory declaring loneliness and isolation a public health epidemic, explicitly citing that 15 cigarette comparison as part of the justification. The advisory noted that even as digital connection has exploded more ways to message, post, and stay in touch than at any point in history, rates of loneliness, particularly among young adults, have continued to climb. Time spent with friends in person, the report noted, has dropped sharply over the past 2 decades. The alarm system is going off more often in more people than it has in generations. Not because people are more isolated in the old sense, surrounded by no one, but because something about modern connection isn't satisfying the actual signal the brain is sending. Which brings us back to that distinction from earlier.
Isolation versus loneliness, quantity versus quality. Holt Lonstad's later research found that the sheer number of relationships a person has barely predicts their health outcomes. What matters is the depth of even a small number of them. Someone with 2 or 3 people they can be genuinely honest with tends to fare far better than someone with 200 acquaintances and no one they'd call in a crisis.
This is why the advice, just go be around people more, so often falls flat. It treats the symptom, not the signal. The brain isn't asking for proximity, it's asking for the specific feeling of being known and of mattering to someone who would notice if you disappeared. That's a much harder thing to manufacture than simply being in a room with other humans. But it's also the only thing the alarm is actually responding to. Here's the part worth sitting with. Loneliness isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It's evidence that an extremely old, extremely well calibrated system is doing exactly what it was built to do. The same system that makes hunger uncomfortable so you'll eat and pain uncomfortable so you'll pull your hand away. It's uncomfortable on purpose. That discomfort is information, not a verdict. The research is also surprisingly hopeful on this point. The same studies that found loneliness can shorten lives also found that even small, genuine connections, a short conversation, a regular check in, one relationship where you don't have to perform, can begin to quiet that alarm. Not because the feeling disappears overnight, but because the system was never asking for a crowd. It was asking for one person in one moment to notice that you were there. For most of human history, that was enough to survive. For your brain deep down, it still is.